Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar to discuss cybersecurity under the second Trump administration. This is part of Venable's Transition Outlook webinar series, where we are discussing key regulatory and policy changes to watch for in the second Trump administration and the 119th Congress. For any members of the press, this discussion is an off-the-record conversation. For any PR needs, please email pr@venable.com. For those seeking CLE credit, we will provide a word to receive credit during this program, both in the middle and at the end. And we want this conversation to be interactive, so we are seeking questions through your chat. You can see it at the bottom. There's a question and answer portal. So as we go through the presentation, we'll be collecting those questions, and then my colleagues and I will be answering those at the end of the presentation. Let me begin by saying hello. I am Caitlin Clark. I'm the Senior Director of Cybersecurity Services here at Venable, and I am joined by two colleagues. Do you want to introduce yourselves, guys?
Alex Barting. I'm Senior Director for Global Security and Technology Strategy at Venable.
I'm Ross Nodorf. I'm a Senior Director for Cybersecurity Services here at Venable. Great.
So let's start with a conversation around the key leaders in the Trump second administration for cybersecurity. You'll notice that there are quite a few who are nominated and not in place yet, but we want to talk through those that we know are nominated and those are in place. First, Sean Cairncross. He's been nominated to be the Cyber Director. He previously served as the CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation under the first Trump administration and has held several leadership roles within the Republican National Committee. This will be a change for the Office of National Cyber Director. Previously, the positions were held by cyber leaders, folks who had significant background in cybersecurity. Sean Cairncross comes with significant background with members of this administration. And so ONCD is perceived to have a more leadership role in the cybersecurity apparatus of the EOP in this second administration. The second key person is Alexei Vilizal. He is Senior Director and Special Assistant to the President for Cyber on the National Security Council. This is his second stint on the National Security Council for Cyber. He previously was a director in 2020 to 2021, focusing on offensive cyber operations, and his appointment really is indicative of a focus on offensive cyber. Our next key leader is Sean Planke. He's been nominated as the director of the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency. He also, like Alexei Vilizal, has served previously on the National Security Council under the first Trump administration from 2018 to 2019, and then led a sector risk management agency's cyber program within the Department of Energy. So his position within CISA brings together both that National Security Council position and experience, as well as experience within a sector risk management agency, which CISA has responsibility for 8 of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Within DoD, there are 2 key players. Katie Sutton, who's been nominated to serve as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. She will be just the second person in that role that focuses on cybersecurity policy across the military branches and across the combatant commands to bring a coherent cyber strategy across DoD. And then, Ross, if I could turn to you for Katie Arrington.
Sure. Quick comment on Katie Sutton first. Katie Sutton was also spent several years working as a congressional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So she has the congressional experience as well. And then Katie Arrington. Katie Arrington is currently performing the duties of Chief Information Officer for the Department of Defense. She served in the prior Trump administration as the CISO for Acquisition and Sustainment Directorate. She is best known for the development and promulgation of the initial Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC, for those of you who are familiar with that acronym. She is continuing to look across the ecosystem at things like supply chain risk and cybersecurity risks, and she's also taking a more a greater role in the approach that the department is playing towards acquisition of technologies, modern, advanced commercial technology solutions.
Great, thank you, Ross. And then the final leader we just want to highlight for everyone is Greg Barbacia, who's serving as the Federal Chief Information Officer. I think key here is that he's held several roles as in the C-suite within private sector, within technology companies and technology defense support companies, bringing a private sector approach and understanding of technology within the federal government and within the Federal CIO Council. So I think what you're going to see out of the Federal CIO's office is really a push towards and a focus on bringing private sector practices within the federal government as we're looking at use of technology, where technology will be within federal departments and agencies, and the kinds of newer technologies that perhaps the federal government may not have leaned into before, some things like some new AI technologies or other automation that will be part of the conversation now. Ross, do you have any sense on that as from your perspective?
Greg is taking a look across the ecosystem and wants to understand how large enterprises govern their own approach to technology. He's done he's only put out a pair of memos to date. Right now, he is his office is the one that drove the update that was recently published last Friday or Thursday, I believe, on AI policy and then AI acquisition policy.
Great, thanks. And reminder, if you have any questions, please put those into the Q&A. I wanted to give a sense of the cyber threat landscape that the Trump 2.0 administration is walking into office with. Just over the last year in 2024, there were significant cyber intrusions or publicizing of cyber campaigns. So I want to walk through first in February some key events. One was the U.S. government advisory on Volt Typhoon, which is the PRC-aligned threat actors who have been described as gaining access for disruption across multiple sectors of critical infrastructure in the U.S., not for espionage purposes, but for potential of disruption during times of conflict. So we've got a Volt Typhoon threat actor that we are focused on across U.S. critical infrastructure. It's multiple sectors, from communications to transportation to energy. At the same time, there is ongoing financially motivated cybercrime happening also against critical infrastructure. Last February was a major ransomware attack on a healthcare payment processor. That was followed by additional ransomware attacks all throughout 2024. The speed and the intensity of cyber attacks from ransomware actors was less in 2024 than in 2023. In 2023, there was a 74% increase of attacks, ransomware attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure. That dipped in 2024, likely due to some of the disruptive actions the U.S. government took against groups like Lockbit and Alpha v. Black Cat. But at the end of the year, there was still a 15% increase in attacks from 2023 to 2024. So our threat environment, as this team is coming in, we have Volt Typhoon targeting of critical infrastructure. We have financially motivated ransomware actors targeting critical infrastructure. We also had the revelation in October of 2024 of Salt Typhoon, another PRC-aligned threat actor having compromised U.S. telecom. And that is ongoing and still trying to understand what that looks like. But all of this is the environment in which the Trump second administration is coming in to cybersecurity and having to align policy to address the potential disruption to critical services to Americans, from healthcare to telecom to transportation to water to energy. And so that leads us to our conversation about the priorities for this Trump second administration and what we think they're going to focus on. The Biden-Harris administration really had a focus on establishing minimum cybersecurity requirements sector by sector. They started with pipelines after Colonial Pipeline, putting in requirements for owners and operators of pipelines. Then that moved into rail and surface transportation. It moved into approaches within the healthcare system, within the maritime transportation system, putting in specific requirements by sector to increase cybersecurity, what most people call cyber hygiene, but increasing the requirements of the controls that owners and operators of critical infrastructure would have. What we're seeing writ large from the Trump administration is a focus on deregulation. For every one regulation being pursued in 2025, 10 being pulled back. What that means for cyber, we're not sure yet. A lot of the rulemaking on sector by sector cybersecurity requirements was done in the previous year, the final year of the Biden-Harris administration. And so that rulemaking process is still ongoing, or in some cases, the rules are not yet effective, but maybe in the next 6 months. Another key piece of the Biden-Harris administration that is a little different, and again, focus on that deregulatory push for the Trump administration, is that the Biden-Harris administration really focused on using the power of the US government purse to drive cybersecurity controls within software vendors. That was really a focus of Executive Order 14028 and continued into the second Executive Order 14114, which came out right before the end of the Biden-Harris administration. This is going to be an area, I think, where we're going to see where the Trump administration goes in terms of how they see working with federal vendors. Ross, I don't know if you have something that you want to chime in here on the administration's approach to vendors and software.
Right now, they are looking at really embracing and using the most modern and advanced commercial technology, and they're looking across the pathways to market to make sure that they're minimizing the friction points in that chain. Everything from what are your compliance and certification requirements, and how do we minimize the friction there, to how are we promoting adoption of commercial technology in a direct contractual fashion. They're also looking across the acquisition space to figure out how to consolidate and drive enterprise government-wide agreements for commercial adoption.
Right. I think what we're hearing is a lot of how private sector does business and bringing it into the U.S. government, I think, which is a consistent theme that we're seeing in this administration, but being applied as well to cybersecurity. The big change I want to focus on is in the bottom part of this chart here, where when it came to deterring cyber actors against targeting the U.S., the Biden-Harris administration took an approach of international norms, of creating coalitions around what was considered responsible behavior in cyberspace and having an international conversation about what is considered out of norm. So they focused a lot on the counter ransomware initiative to bring a global community together to talk about ways to defend against ransomware, have consistent policy between countries around things like payment, government payment of ransom, and focus on particular sectors where a lot of ransomware attacks were occurring, like in healthcare. And that really guided where the focus on minimum cyber requirements went and conversations across international partnerships. What we've heard about the incoming team is that they're going to be focused less on the defensive measures, not that those won't still be important, but a renewed focus on a more muscular cyber offense. So as we look at how do we deter cyber threat actors from targeting the United States, the Biden-Harris administration took a defensive approach, ensuring that defenses were in place in critical infrastructure to protect against those attacks. What we're seeing from the Trump administration is a focus on offensive cyber, so kind of hacking back as our critical infrastructure is being held at risk by threat actors. How do we ensure that the environments in which threat actors are working, that their critical infrastructure is also held at risk? So we kind of get in this conversation of moving the line so it's clear that targeting of critical infrastructure is not accepted. So using our offensive capability to deter the targeting vice a proactive defense. Again, I don't think that there's going to be a complete 180 and that we're not going to be focused on defense. I think there's going to be a stronger emphasis on where the US government or others can play a role in an offensive cyber position and posture. We haven't heard a lot about this, but this is something that we've heard that this administration wants to look at, and we'll keep an eye on what this means for owners and operators of critical infrastructure and private sector as we look at the potential ways that offensive cyber could occur in the US. All right, so when I talk about, go ahead, Ross. We talked about some of the Biden-Harris administration's push on regulations to drive improvement in cybersecurity. Well, but we're thinking about how the Trump 2.0 administration will address that. I think there's really three key rulemaking that will set a tone for where they will be going for the rest of this administration. First is CERCIA. It requires infrastructure companies to confidentially report cyber attacks to CISA within 3 days of an attack and report ransomware payments within 24 hours. This was intended to try to harmonize some of the cyber incident reporting requirements through the rulemaking process. There is some concerns from private sector that it didn't actually get to that it actually, the scope of the rule as developed under the Biden-Harris administration brings a lot of burden to critical infrastructure owners and operators, and the scope of the cyber incidents that may be reported are rather broad. So it may be pulling cybersecurity professionals from responding to cyber incidents in order to report cyber incidents. This rulemaking is ongoing, and Congress is looking at this pretty closely. I think how CISA addresses this ongoing rulemaking will be indicative of where the administration will go. Will they pull it back completely, or will they tweak it based off of feedback? I think CERCIA is going to be one of those areas where it's really going to be a bellwether. How they handle the critical infrastructure incident reporting is going to kind of show where they're going to be in all of the other sectors. Some of the other ones I wanted to highlight as also bellwether, the SEC Cybersecurity Risk Management Strategy Governance and Incident Disclosure Rule. This is the reporting of material cyber incidents within 4 days of determination of materiality and reporting those publicly. There's been a request of the administration of the new SEC leadership to rescind that rule. So the SEC has rescinded quite a few rules, has stopped some enforcement actions that were put in place at the end of the Biden-Harris administration. This is another area we're going to watch closely to see what they do with this rule, because it's not just the incident disclosure rule. There's also requirements within that around cyber risk management for publicly traded companies. So rescinding the entire rule would mean rescinding the requirements about the cyber risk management for boards, how cyber risk is communicated to board structures. And so this is one where it'd be interested, we're going to watch to see whether or not they do anything with this rule, if they rescind the entire rule, or if they rescind portions of the rule. And then the third one that I really want to highlight, because this rulemaking was put out just at the end of the Biden-Harris administration on updating the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act Security Rule, HIPAA. This was to really enhance the HIPAA security rule to move from addressed cybersecurity requirements and implementation specifications to required, and really highlight specific controls that are expected to be in place in healthcare entities that are processing private health information. This rulemaking is ongoing. Why I want to highlight this is a lot of this rule was built off of National Security Memorandum 22 on critical infrastructure security and resilience, around a policy towards requirements for security and resilience within each of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. This rule is indicative of the Biden-Harris approach of we will set out those minimum requirements and hold people accountable to them. How this administration either continues this rulemaking process or pauses this rulemaking process as NSM 22 is being reviewed and potentially revised, again, is bellwether for us. We have to watch this one to see how they are going to be approaching specific critical sectors, and are we going to stick with it? Will there continue to be a voluntary approach, or will there be a continued push for requirements? So these are three. There's another that I mentioned earlier. The Coast Guard has a rule for the maritime transportation sector that is scheduled to go into effect July 16th. We have not yet heard anything around whether or not that rule is being reviewed or for rescission or amendment, but that is another one that, again, will be indicative of how this administration is approaching cybersecurity via regulation or voluntary approach. Ross, anything to add on this?
I would just add that for that particular rule, the Coast Guard added 6 months for implementation to push it into effect. So which is why it's going into effect here in July. But it was finalized in January. So we'll see how it goes. Again, I think all of these areas are decision points that the administration is currently reconciling and will help us understand kind of the direction they're going, to your point, Kate.
And I think one of the really interesting things that we've seen thus far is this administration has rolled back several EOs that were put in place by the Biden-Harris administration, rescinding them or, for the most part, rescinding them or considering amendments. Thus far, the 2 EOs from the Biden-Harris administration on cybersecurity, EO 14028 and EO 14114, have not been rescinded. I do not expect that that will continue. I think we might see some amendments to at least the second EO to reflect where this administration is going. And so that's another area we just need to watch. EO 14114, which was, I believe, released the last week of the Biden-Harris administration. Go ahead, Ross.
I do want to call out a couple things. One, keep dropping Q&A. We're happy to answer them. We'll get to them. I know Caitlin, we're gonna push through the slides that we have, and then we'll start running through the questions. So if you have questions or any of the slides, please put them in the Q&A. Caitlin, the other thing I wanted to bring up that we didn't have in here is, while the administration is taking a look at what their approach is, Congress is also reckoning with certain laws that are coming to an end. They're sunsetting. So CISA 2015 specifically.
Got it.
Sorry.
Go for it.
No, you're up. Didn't mean to get ahead of it. Go ahead.
No, I think, so Ross is talking about some of the key legislative points with cybersecurity, and three of the ones we just want to highlight. As he said, the Cyber Information Sharing Act of 2015 is up for reauthorization this year. This is the law that provides exemptions and shields against disclosure for this sharing of cyber threat indicators. This is the law that underpins a lot of the public-private partnerships that have been stood up to share information around cyber defenses, around threats to critical infrastructure in a way that protects that information from disclosure or from liability. That sunsets in September. Whether or not that law gets either a clean reauth or potentially some changes is something that we're looking at. I think it underpins most of what the first Trump administration was prioritizing with working with critical infrastructure. So we see this as key. Ross, I know you've got something on this one as well, unless you don't.
On which, sorry, the
CISA reauth.
It's, we're constantly monitoring what the conversations look like here, and there's a bipartisan intention to extend this rule so that we can continue to have that information sharing. I mean, that's the only thing we can say right now, but there is a lot of energy and enthusiasm for looking at this before it sunsets.
The second piece that we're hearing a lot from the Hill is on regulatory harmonization. So where there is cybersecurity regulation in sectors that have been regulated for years, I mentioned quite a few where the Biden-Harris administration initiated rulemaking and establishing regulation for cybersecurity, but there are several other sectors with regulatory authority going back 15 years in security and soundness, where there are sometimes overlapping and duplicative requirements. And so they're looking at reintroducing legislation focused on reducing that duplication and overlap, and some conversations around reciprocity. So for a single entity that is regulated by multiple federal departments and agencies, is there a mechanism by which a single agency can do the assessments and the investigations, and then that can be accepted by other federal government agencies who also have authority over that particular critical infrastructure owner or operator? This is something that was proposed in the last Congress. They proposed ONCD, the Office of National Cyber Director, taking a leadership role in this, plus a pilot to look at reciprocity. We'll look to see if that comes back up. There is a lot of talk, both from the majority and the minority, around addressing harmonization. There's a recognition that we need to protect from cybersecurity threats, but are we doing it in a way that balances protection versus compliance requirements, where we are pulling cybersecurity teams away from actually protecting networks in order to respond to regulatory requests? And then the final piece that we're tracking, which is aligned to some of the other executive actions taken thus far by the Trump 2.0 administration, is the state and local cybersecurity grant program. Congress is currently debating how to continue that program and improve state and local cybersecurity. This goes hand in glove with an executive order released a couple weeks ago now on resilience and preparedness, in which there is an approach by this administration to push responsibility for incident response and preparedness to the states and the locals. And so with that responsibility comes cost. There's currently a significant risk with pushing some of that responsibility to the state and local level without funding and capability to go with it. So we might be just shifting the risk picture from a federal government agency to a state and local government agency. This grant program is really key to how we're looking and how this administration is looking at funding that transition of risk from federal government to state and local government. Ross, anything on this one?
Again, I would just reiterate, this was a subject of a recent hearing, and there is a lot of bipartisan focus on this. There's an understanding that the state and local entities are not, in many cases, are not as far along as some of our federal government agencies are in protecting their networks and assets and data. And I think there is a need and an understanding about the needs that the states have, and a consensus that they have to find a way to fix it. There was no, I do want to be clear, they did not agree at the hearing that they were going to definitely extend the grant program, but they did agree that they have to solve the underlying problem of how the states are going to resource and fund the necessary protections that they have.
Great. Thanks, Ross. We talked a lot about what's going on here in the US, but I think with cybersecurity, it's really important to recognize that I know this sounds trite, but there really are no borders in cyber. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alex, to talk about what we're seeing globally with cybersecurity and how the Trump 2.0 administration might be impacting global cybersecurity and approaches from our allies and partners. Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
Before Alex jumps in, I do want to read our CLE code for those of you who are interested in that. It's Cyber Under 2025. Again, it's Cyber Under 2025. Alex, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, friends. Yes, so I will do a quick whip around the globe because there is a lot going on the cyber policy front, but it will sort of set the scene for where things are. So let's start in Europe. We were told a number of times last year by Commission officials there would be no new cyber acts in the 25 to 29 term, but don't let that fool you. There is still plenty going on the cyber policy front because they passed an awful lot of cybersecurity acts and directives in the previous term. So simultaneously, companies are managing the implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act. That is a set of requirements that are largely on digital products, or at least designed to be put on digital products, a little bit like the US's Cyber Trust Mark. In reality, they have defined it in a very broad way, such that it will encapsulate a large number of goods and potentially services that are entering the EU market. And these will be a prerequisite for selling into the EU. So that is probably the most significant one that we're tracking in terms of the breadth and potential impact of it. That will play out over the next couple of years. At the same time, you've got an update to the Network and Information Systems Directive, which is the EU's critical infrastructure legislation. So that's the cybersecurity requirements we put on energy companies and communications companies and financial services and so on. That is an update, but again, the breadth of coverage is significantly expanding. We're expecting somewhere between 7 to 10 times as many companies to get brought into scope of the NIS2 than with NIS1. So a lot of companies at the moment are, for the first time, having to assess their internal requirements against national legislation. And there's a complex process that goes on in the EU with a directive whereby there's a kind of EU-wide set of rules, but then the member states individually have to transpose them into their domestic law, and that can occasionally lead to divergence in terms of how they do that. So it can end up being quite complex if you're, for instance, a communications company that operates in 20 of the 27 EU markets. Linked to that, there's something called DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, specific on financial services. It's a little bit like the NIS2 directive, except that it goes into more detail and I would say has slightly more onerous requirements on those financial services companies, but also on those companies that provide digital services to them. So they're kind of key cloud service providers, for instance. Alongside that, just before the final, one of the final acts of the previous commission at the end of 2024 was to pass something called the Cyber Solidarity Act, which is focused on how are we prepared for widespread cybersecurity incidents that may be cross borders within the EU. And there's a few different things that act does, but one of the main things is it establishes a cyber reserve, which is basically a load of cybersecurity incident response companies that are on retainer with the EU that can at any time be activated to support critical infrastructure entities or government entities that need incident response. That one's probably most relevant for companies that provide cybersecurity services. And then finally, in terms of existing acts, so technically keeping their promise of no new cyber acts, they are reviewing the Cybersecurity Act, though, which was kind of the foundational piece of legislation in the EU that established ENISA, which is kind of their cybersecurity agency in the EU, and a raft of certification schemes. So rather than looking to international standards, the EU basically said, we're going to come up with our own version of common criteria, and we're going to have our own certification for cloud services and the security of 5G products and digital managed service providers. Those, with the exception of EUCC, have not been finalized yet. They're all in process, and particularly for the cloud services one, somewhat controversial because the EU, certain EU member states, principally France, wanted to include sovereignty requirements at the highest level there. So basically you need to onshore data into Europe in order to qualify for the highest tier of that certification. That pivots us to today. And when they said no new cyber acts, what they in practice, that doesn't mean nothing new on cyber is happening in 2025, even beyond those things that are being implemented. Tensions have risen between the EU and the US, and the EU is responding to that in myriad ways, but one of them is this drive towards digital sovereignty has broadened at the member state level. So you will see embedded within things like the recent Protect EU proposal, which is kind of their internal security proposal, their digital work plan for the next 5 years, and a floated or leaked potential for an act on sovereign cloud. That digital sovereignty is a consistent strain across a lot of what the EU is doing. I'm sure folks will have seen in the press how there's going to be new investments in defense and things like that. There is also going to be a concerted push to bring more critical services onto EU territory and reduce their dependency on US providers in the medium term, but in particular on US infrastructure. Next slide, Keelan, if you could. So a lot going on in the EU. I'm not going to go through all of these, but likewise, the UK has open at the moment 2 public consultations and just released this an overview of their cybersecurity resilience bill, which is their own critical infrastructure cybersecurity bill, as well as these new codes of practice. Japan is just passed its active cyber defense bill through the Diet, which is their lower house of the legislature. And Australia is continuing to implement the various components of its cybersecurity strategy, again, focused on things like critical infrastructure, ransomware, incident reporting. Next slide, please. The result of this is when you look at things from an international level, Caitlin mentioned earlier, there's a regulatory harmonization effort ongoing within the US, or at least expected to be a drive for that under the Trump administration. The divergence that we see gets far more complicated once you get to an international level if you are a multinational company. Just as an example, 100 countries have established critical infrastructure sectors, and most of those have cyber policies that are required of critical infrastructure sectors. Across those countries, those many, many dozens of countries, they each define the critical infrastructures sectors differently. What size of company within each of those sectors is in scope. What we require from a security perspective varies. Incident reporting thresholds and timelines vary. And this is just in one area of cybersecurity policy. We desperately need more international alignment of cyber policies. And one project that we have worked on with the Coalition to Reduce Cyber Risk is, first of all, a taxonomy for what that looks like. So we kind of break this out across regulatory diplomacy, which is how can we share information with one another about future rulemaking, future policies, so that we can share information before we put those requirements in place and hopefully come to a more common standards or frameworks and taxonomies at a national level. There's the regulatory alignment or harmonization, which is about saying, okay, if you in Japan have a critical infrastructure policy and we in Europe have a critical infrastructure policy, given that our objectives are the same, how do we better align what we require of you in terms of ensuring the protection of critical systems? And then finally, reciprocity, which is a question of if we think our existing approaches are similar enough, how do we facilitate a certify once, comply with many kind of regime? So maybe that's a mutual recognition agreement between our two countries that says, if you are following this particular European standard and you're certified against that, then that meets our needs in Singapore to comply with our legislation. The overarching problem here is that more and more cybersecurity budgets are getting devoted to compliance, and that can be a drag on money that's going to operational cybersecurity activities. Next slide, please. Just as an example, we looked across I think in total, we looked across 8 different areas of cybersecurity policymaking and pulled out, we did an assessment of the prioritization of industry within industry of addressing the divergence on the one hand, and then the feasibility of doing so on the other. And we pulled out these 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 potential regulatory cooperation initiatives that we think the US government and their counterparts around the world should be driving towards in the coming years. And I'm happy, a copy of this report is available up on the Coalition to Reduce Cyber Risk website should folks want to go and read the whole report. Next slide, please. The challenge is in an increasingly hostile geopolitical environment, where do you go to do that particular work? Some that have been floated, the OECD, the G7, ASEAN, which is the Southeast Asia Regional Forum, the Quad, which is was kind of an ad hoc coalition that came together between India, the US, Australia, and Japan, but is now become increasingly formalized in the cooperation work that they do together? Or do we just look at pulling together an ad hoc cyber cooperation group where we just say, we think these 4 or 5 countries tend to view the world the way that we do. And therefore, we're just going to get together with them and work on this particular issue. It doesn't have to be an existing forum. But there is a bit of soul searching on this front at the moment as to which of these forums is the most advantageous to choose to advance these activities. And candidly, none of them is perfect. I think there's trade-offs. Next slide, please. I think just to take a step up to a 30,000-foot view of this, one of the challenges that we're finding from a geopolitical perspective is different objectives from different countries make it very difficult for us to find an effective mechanism to drive this forward. If you just look at some of the, I guess, power players in terms of setting regulations and policies around the world, we can obviously see the US government is promoting an America First agenda in which it wants to drive fairer or more advantageous terms for American companies operating abroad. Europe's response to that has been trying to drive domestic digital sovereignty. So how do we ensure from Europe's perspective that we're more immune to that push from the US? China continues to want to drive exports of technology products and services, whether that's in the telecommunications space, cloud, and so on. And in many cases, just as each of these players is trying to push for change in one direction, their counterpart is specifically making attempts to counter it elsewhere. And that doesn't give a great geopolitical backdrop to solve some of this divergence, in particular because in the case of Europe, for instance, they really do see regulation as one of their kind of primary ways to influence the global market. One group that I think has gotten less attention is if you look at Asia without China, so you're looking at India, the Southeast Asian economies, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and so on. There is a strong desire for certainty around security and for certainty around trade. And I do think there is a particular opportunity amongst that collection of countries to drive more coherence and a stronger trading platform amongst those countries. So think of it as CPTPP group of countries with a few extra ones bolted on. And if I had to guess where we will see most progress on these issues, I think it's going to be, particularly if the US can look to that collection of countries, I think we can have an awful lot of progress in driving a slightly easier cybersecurity environment for companies to navigate. The $1 million question, though, is how do all of these drivers fit together, and where will we see progress over the next few years? And frankly, my opinions on that change on a pretty much weekly basis at the moment. I think that is the end of our pre-prepared slides. But we do have a few questions.
A question? Yeah, I think we got a question about how and where do we envision public-private collaboration and coordination on cyber in the Trump administration, given that public-private mechanisms like the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council and the Cyber Safety Review Board have been disbanded. For those who are not tracking the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council, that while entitled an advisory council was actually a lot of authorities delegated by the Secretary of Homeland Security to allow for public-private partnership and particularly private sector consensus, private sector recommendations on specific issue areas outside of the Federal Advisory Committee Act constructs, where you have to notice the meeting, you have to have a public agenda, you have to have the meeting, it needs to be open to everyone. It's the authority which underpinned the sector coordinating councils, the government coordinating councils, a lot of the enduring security framework, which was an NSA-led organization that looked at future risk to technology. They came out with cybersecurity for 5G. That was done under the CPAC authority. What I think in this case, one of the things I think is hard to answer because we don't yet have Sean Planky in place yet at CISA, and how CISA is going to organize with the sector construct, how they are going to organize with sector risk management agencies, is really going to drive the public-private mechanisms under the second Trump administration. And that goes hand in glove, the nomination and the confirmation of Sean Planky, who not only has the background from the National Security Council, but as a leader of a sector risk management agency working with things like the Government Coordinating Council for Energy and the Sector Coordinating Council for Energy. That perspective is going to be coupled with, I mentioned that the administration is doing a review of National Security Memorandum 22, Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience. And that was really designed around the public-private partnerships that have been existing under CPAC for 15 years. So I think the review of NSM 22 plus the confirmation of Sean Planky will guide and really be the place where we see the public-private collaboration model come out for this administration. Ross, do you have anything that you would add to that?
I mean, look, I think there was an earlier question that asked similarly, like how do we see the Trump administration working with, partnering with critical infrastructure sector companies that are dealing with this in real time, companies for whom these regulations are going to impact, right? Do we think that the Trump administration is going to reach out to partner with them in any way? It is too early to tell how, but I think, I mean, in general conversations with various people who have worked with or advised the Trump administration, there's an intentionality to work with the private sector to help them to really understand the impacts and implications of regulations and where those regulations are helpful in some cases and where those regulations could be harmful or restructured in a way where it achieves shared outcomes for success, right? So that's what we're hearing right now. We have not necessarily seen how those discussions are going to be implemented in a manner that is consistent across the various sector risk management agencies or other points in which those interactions occur.
So a lot of the public-private partnerships, the current constructs that we're familiar with, these sector coordinating councils and even the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, were really a lot based off of the doctrine from the late aughts, I guess is what you would say, from the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, which really established a lot of these sector coordinating councils. And all of that is under review under the resilience EO that the administration put out a couple weeks ago. So as Ross said, I think the intentionality is there to work with the private sector on these challenges. These specific mechanisms, though, and the specific structure of how that will work, I think is very much still in discussion as they review those policies and as they get their team in place. If it was not clear from the slide of the leadership, a lot of the team in cyber is not in place yet. And so I think we need to, when they do get in place, we are going to see, I think, more clear direction and more clear statements from this administration about how they are approaching cybersecurity. Absent those folks in those positions, we haven't heard a lot. Do we have any other questions coming in? I know we're nearly at the top of the hour.
I actually think we had a couple of other questions, but I think most of them come back to that sort of public-private partnership piece of things.
I know we've had a lot of folks ask for the CLE code, so let me read that out loud real quick to people. It is cyber under 2025, CYBERUNDER 2025.
But yeah, I would just, echo that point that my strong expectation is that we will see them bring back mechanisms for facilitating, threat information, threat intelligence sharing, and things like that. One other thing to watch, just pivoting it to the international side, is the extent to which the geopolitical uncertainty is impacting that kind of operational collaboration in an international setting. As one data point, which I am yet to run down, but I've heard from two different people now, is that CERT EU has paused cooperation with US companies on threat information sharing, which, if true, would be a pretty remarkable step to take, given the fact that US cybersecurity companies are the leaders internationally and tend to have the best visibility. Why does that matter? Well, because information about cyber threats is generated all over the world, right? And if either we have a blind spot into a certain part of the world, or the EU gets a blind spot into certain parts of the world, fundamentally that is a net negative for cybersecurity.
Thanks, Alex. I just want to highlight the next webinar in the transition series is next Wednesday, about a retrospective of the first 100 days of the second Trump administration. So if you're interested in having a regulatory retrospective, that is next Wednesday at 2 p.m. And I believe we put the registration link into the chat. So if you're interested in discussion of the look back as opposed to the look forward, please join us next week. Again, if you have any questions, Ross, Alex, and I, you had our contact information at the top of the presentation. Please reach out if you have a question. We'll do our best to answer. There's a lot of, one of the things with cyber is there's a lot of uncertainty sometimes, and right now, until we get the leadership in place, we're still trying to, I think, navigate right now. And once the leadership is in place, we'll set a course with this administration as to where they're going. Sorry, I was on a maritime webinar earlier, so I'm going to make boat themed metaphors. Thank you guys. Thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate your participation and the questions that came in. Thank you to my colleagues, Ross and Alex, for joining me today. And we will see you next time on the next Venable Transition webinar series.